In the long list of aviation's greatest mysteries, there's the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, and then there's everything else.
Amelia Earhart.
Amelia Earhart.
Amelia Earhart.
Amelia Earhart vanished on the final leg of her quest to be the first woman to fly around the world.
More than 80 years ago, Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan vanished over the Pacific Ocean. Their plane was never found. Decades later, the world is still searching for answers. What happened to Earhart and her navigator during their daring attempt to circle the globe? No distress call, no confirmed wreckage, no clear trail. Only questions and a legacy that refuses to fade. This is the story of how Amelia Earhart vanished and the traces she may have left behind. Amelia Earhart's love for the skies began long before her historic flight of 1937. While working as a nurse's aide at Spadina Military Hospital during World War I, Earhart attended local air exhibitions, igniting a lifelong fascination with aviation. A few years later, in 1920, she took her first plane ride in Long Beach, California, with pilot Frank Hawks. On a 10-minute flight to about 300 feet, 92 meters, she later said, "By the time I got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I was going to fly." The following year marked a turning point in Earhart's life. She began official flying lessons with instructor Nita Snook. She purchased 12 hours of flight time, split into several lessons lasting 10 to 15 minutes each. These lessons were quite expensive for Earhart, setting her back $15 per session, about $180 in today's money. Determined to keep flying, she worked as a photographer and truck driver, which allowed her to save $1,000 and fund her passion. Unlike today, aviation in the early 1920s wasn't heavily regulated. In fact, this was right in the middle of the barnstorming era, a wild period in aviation history that featured daring performers known as wing walkers. These performers would literally walk, dangle, or hang from the wings, struts, or landing gear of airplanes in flight, often without parachutes. In this freewheeling atmosphere, it wasn't unusual for amateurs to fly solo without a license, and Earhart did just that. By mid-1921, she purchased a used Kenner Airster biplane she called the Canary. After many solo flights, she set a women's altitude record of 14,000 feet, 4,267 meters, in October 1922. The following year, Earhart became the 16th woman in the world to receive a pilot's license from the FAI. However, financial difficulties soon forced her to take a complete break from flying. She sold her Kenner Airster and shifted her focus to social work, education, and advocacy. A few years later, in 1928, Amelia Earhart returned to aviation in a big way. She became the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air, though not as a pilot, but as a passenger aboard the seaplane Friendship. They took off from Trepassey Harbor, Newfoundland, and after 21 hours in the air, landed in the Bury Port estuary in Wales due to poor visibility and low fuel. Later, in May 1932, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, flying a Lockheed Vega 5B from Newfoundland to Ireland. Upon returning to the United States, Earhart's achievement was celebrated, drawing comparisons to Charles Lindbergh, who successfully completed a transatlantic flight a few years prior. The press soon dubbed her Lady Lindy.
Here you see Lady Lindy, whose triumphant solo flight across the Atlantic is the admiration of the whole world.
Almost a decade later, in early 1936, Earhart began planning her flight around the world.
I hope to accomplish something really scientifically worthwhile for aviation.
While others had already circled the globe, her route, following a path close to the equator, would be the longest, covering approximately 29,000 miles, 47,000 kilometers. If successful, she would become the first woman to complete such a journey. With the help of Purdue University, Earhart took delivery of her Lockheed Electra 10E on her 39th birthday for $80,000, with Purdue University contributing $50,000, about $1.13 million today. The plane was registered as NR16020, the N indicating that it was a U.S. civil aircraft, the last 5 digits being the aircraft's unique registration number, and the R signifying a restricted category, due to extensive modifications planned for the flight. 149 Lockheed Electra 10 were built, originally designed for commercial use. However, its standard configuration was inadequate for Amelia Earhart's ambitious journey. To prepare for the flight, she had most of the fuselage windows covered, removed all 8 passenger seats, and installed 6 additional fuel tanks, which she had to crawl over to access the cockpit. As a result, a small hatch was added to the top of the fuselage for emergency exit and easier cockpit access. The extra tanks, combined with the plane's original 6-wing tanks, increased its range from around 700 miles, 1,126 kilometers, to approximately 4,000 miles, 6,437 kilometers. This modification added roughly 4,000 pounds, 1,814 kilograms, to the aircraft's weight, which would create challenges during takeoff. To offset this, Earhart replaced the stock Pratt & Whitney R-985 Wasp Jr. engines, which produced 450 horsepower each, with more powerful 600 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-1340 Wasp engines. Once completed, the plane was dubbed the Flying Laboratory. In addition, the aircraft was equipped with 6 radio antennas, each serving a specific function. At the rear was the longest antenna, a trailing wire antenna that could be reeled out like a fishing line to about 250 feet, 76 meters. This wire enabled the aircraft to transmit and receive Morse code using low-frequency radio waves, around 500 kilohertz, a range commonly used by ships and coastal stations for long-distance communication. The V-shaped antennas mounted on top of the fuselage were used for higher-frequency voice communications, typically 3,000 to 6,000 kilohertz. A belly antenna on the underside of the aircraft was used to receive those same high-frequency signals. Positioned above the cockpit was a direction-finding loop antenna, which could be rotated to determine the bearing of incoming radio transmissions. After completing all modifications, Amelia Earhart was ready to embark on her flight around the globe. Accompanying her was Fred Noonan, a licensed ship captain experienced in both marine and flight navigation. On March 17, 1937, Earhart, Noonan, Manning, and Mance departed from Oakland, California to Honolulu, Hawaii, on the first leg of the journey.
Amelia Earhart leaves Oakland for Honolulu, setting out on the most dangerous aeronautic feat ever attempted, to traverse the waistline of the world.
After a 16-hour flight, the crew landed in Hawaii. This leg, however, would be the first and last for Earhart and her team, as just after takeoff from Honolulu, the right landing gear collapsed, followed by the left, causing the plane to skid along the runway on its belly. This failure was due to problems with the variable pitch mechanisms of the propeller hubs. As a result, the rest of the route was canceled, and the aircraft was taken to the U.S. Navy's Luke Field at Pearl Harbor for servicing and repairs. After the crash in Hawaii, Earhart and her team took time to repair the aircraft and reconsider their plans. With shifting seasonal winds, Earhart decided to try again, this time flying east instead of west. However, this second attempt would be without some of the original crew members, as only Earhart and Noonan would continue the expedition. The pair departed Oakland, California on May 20th, 1937, and headed east. The trip included several stops in the US, South America, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. On some flights, Earhart experienced bad weather, specifically in Southeast Asia, where the journey coincided with the region's monsoon season. After 40 days, Earhart and Noonan arrived at Lae, New Guinea, on June 29, 1937. The two had already completed 29 out of the 34 planned legs, which totaled 22,000 miles, 35,400 kilometers. The remaining 7,000 miles, 11,200 kilometers, would be over the Pacific. The following leg would be the longest, about 2,556 miles, 4,113 kilometers. The plan was to stop a third of the way from New Guinea to Hawaii on a tiny piece of land called Howland Island. This island was so small that it didn't even have a runway. A landing strip was constructed in advance specifically for Earhart's stopover as part of a U.S. government initiative which had the support of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The mission would also include 3 support ships to assist Earhart and Noonan during their flight between Lae and Howland Island. The USS Swan, located between Howland Island and Oahu, the USS Ontario, positioned roughly halfway between Lae and Howland Island, and the Itasca, a U.S. Coast Guard patrol ship stationed near Howland Island. The Itasca was responsible for handling most of the communications between the aircraft and the ground. On July 2, 1937, at 10 a.m. local time, Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan took off from Lae, New Guinea toward Howland Island with favorable weather conditions. 4 hours into the flight, Earhart reported an altitude of 7,000 feet, 2,133 meters, and a speed of 140 knots using daytime frequency 6210 kHz. She ended the transmission with her routine sign-off, "Everything's okay." However, despite repeated attempts at 10:20, 11:20, and 12:20, she never responded to messages from Lae warning of increasing headwinds. It is believed that Earhart likely never heard the transmissions, possibly due to equipment failure, frequency misalignment, or other technical issues. Around the 6-hour mark after departing from Lae, Earhart made a radio transmission reporting unexpected headwinds. However, she made no mention of earlier warnings from Lae radio operators about poor radio reception or other issues. This was possibly caused by a fault in the receiving equipment or a broken belly antenna, which might have broken off during takeoff. Though unconfirmed, some observers later reported that they saw an antenna hanging loose as the aircraft departed. That being said, her ability to receive voice messages appears to have been seriously compromised. At about 7 p.m., Earhart was expected to fly over the USS Ontario. The Ontario was assigned to broadcast homing signals on 400 kHz using Morse code. The Ontario would transmit the letter N, while the Itasca, positioned near Howland Island, would later transmit the letter A. This system was designed to help Earhart and Noonan distinguish between the signals and determine the ship's bearing using radio direction finding equipment. Originally, Earhart assumed she would first radio the Ontario, prompting them to begin transmitting. However, she later realized that the Ontario was not equipped to receive high-frequency radio signals, which meant they would not be able to hear her voice transmissions. The day before takeoff, she sent an urgent telegram asking the ship to transmit the Morse code letter N repeatedly 5 minutes after each hour on 400 kHz, regardless of whether they received a signal from her. Although this plan was in place, no signals from the USS Ontario were ever heard by Earhart, suggesting that either the ship failed to transmit at the scheduled times or, more likely, Earhart's equipment was unable to receive them. Some radio operators later speculated that improper tuning, damaged antennas, or interference might have contributed to this critical navigational failure. Earhart acknowledged that her radio direction-finding equipment was essential in navigating to Howland Island, viewing it as a supplement to Noonan's skills. To understand why detecting these signals was so important and how Earhart planned to use them, we need to look at how her plane's loop and sense antennas worked together to find the direction of the Ontario's transmissions. Radio waves have electric and magnetic fields that move at right angles to each other and to the wave's direction of travel. The loop antenna detects the magnetic field component. When the loop is perpendicular to the signal, the magnetic field passes through it, producing the strongest signal. When the loop faces directly toward the signal, the magnetic field runs parallel to the loop and does not pass through it, causing the signal to nearly disappear. This drop is called a null, which helped her determine the direction of the Ontario. However, because the loop creates two nulls exactly opposite each other, it cannot tell if the signal is coming from in front or behind, creating a directional ambiguity. To solve this problem, Earhart's plane also had a sense antenna located at the belly of the plane. This antenna created a heart-shaped reception pattern that helped determine whether the signal was coming from ahead or behind, allowing her to identify the correct direction. Together, the loop and sense antennas would help her locate the signals sent by the USS Ontario. However, that never happened. In fact, the telegram message sent by Earhart to the USS Ontario specifying the time frame for each signal transmission was likely not received by the time Amelia passed above them. With no way to communicate directly, the Ontario never broadcast the signals Earhart was expecting, and the two parties passed by one another without establishing contact. By that point, Earhart was already about halfway to Howland Island, a remote part in the Pacific with no alternative landing. Turning back to Ley was technically an option, but after delays and one unsuccessful attempt, there was only one option: to continue the journey. The lack of contact with the Ontario must have been concerning, but Earhart was expecting the Itasca to begin transmitting the letter A in Morse code as they approached Howland Island. Even if the Itasca didn't hear from her, the Itasca could also send and receive voice signals and promise to be ready on a range of different frequencies. Around 6:15 a.m. local ship time, radio men aboard the Itasca reported hearing Earhart's voice. She requested, "Please take a bearing on 3105. We'll whistle into the mic. We are about 200 miles out." However, the radio men were confused. They had expected Earhart to take a bearing on the ship's signal, not the other way around. Although the Itasca had radio direction finding equipment, it operated on lower frequencies, between 270 and 550 kilohertz, while Earhart's transmissions were on higher frequencies, making it difficult to determine a precise bearing. Earhart's radio transmissions operated on high-frequency waves, which could skip off the ionosphere and reflect over great distances. However, these reflected signals would scatter and arrive from multiple directions, making it impossible to identify a precise signal direction using her loop antenna. By this point, Earhart and Noonan must have been worried. After flying for 20 hours straight with fuel likely running low, Earhart and Noonan were running out of options. Despite multiple attempts, the pair heard nothing but static and interference. At approximately 6:15 p.m. GCT, Earhart requested a bearing be taken on the frequency 3105 kHz and asked for a report in a half hour. Even if a bearing had been successfully reported, it might have been outdated or inaccurate by the time it was received. Adding to the confusion, Earhart operated on GCT, which she had clearly communicated to the crew of the Coast Guard cutter Itasca. The Itasca, however, kept its logs in local ship's time, 11.5 hours behind GCT, while Howland Island observed UTC 12 o'clock, roughly 12 hours behind GCT. Consequently, all parties operated on different time standards, complicating coordination, radio transmissions, and position reporting. When Earhart's message arrived at 6:45 a.m. local ship time, it was actually 6:15 p.m. GCT where she was flying. This discrepancy has sparked debate over whether Earhart's message truly meant in a half hour, or if she intended on the half hour, referring to 6:30 p.m. GCT just 15 minutes later. Around this time, the Itasca attempted to switch to frequencies better suited for its direction-finding equipment to make a more accurate radio bearing on her signal. On a quarter after transmission, the Itasca sent a message. Cannot take a bearing on 3105 kHz. Please send on 500 kHz. Earhart gave no reply because she could no longer transmit on the low frequency of 500 kHz. The trailing wire antenna required for that frequency had been removed after the Hawaii accident, likely due to its limited role in voice communication. Despite this limitation, Earhart's aircraft still had a loop antenna capable of receiving low-frequency signals, but only if the Itasca transmitted on frequencies compatible with her equipment. Before Earhart's flight, she decided which radio frequency to use for sending signals that the Itasca could track using direction-finding equipment. She talked to a radio expert in Leh who recommended sending a simple Morse code signal, the letter A, which is a dot followed by a dash, repeated regularly at a wavelength of 750 meters. This corresponds to about 400 kHz on the radio dial. However, when Earhart passed this information along to the Itasca, she said 7,500 kHz instead of 400 kHz. It's likely she confused the units, mistaking the wavelength 750 meters for 7,500 kilocycles, a much higher frequency range, well beyond the range supported by the ship's direction-finding equipment. Despite the confusion, Earhart eventually managed to make contact. At 7:42 a.m. ship time, her voice came through the Itasca's radio loud and clear. Several crew members rushed to the deck, hoping to catch a glimpse of her plane overhead. Her urgent message stated,
Itasca, this is King Hao, able Queen. We must be on you, but cannot see you.
Fuel is running low, but unable to receive you by radio.
We are flying at altitude 1,000 feet. Over.
10 minutes later, at 7:52 a.m., Earhart transmitted again. We are circling, but cannot hear you. Go ahead on 7,500. The Itasca responded immediately, transmitting repeated Morse code A's, dot, dash, on 7,500 kHz as she had previously requested. The transmission successfully reached the aircraft, marking the first official contact between the Itasca and the Electra. Earhart quickly turned her loop antenna to locate the null point to determine the source of the transmission. However, at 7,500 kHz, the high-frequency radio waves were bending and bouncing off the ionosphere, arriving from multiple directions. This skywave propagation caused unreliable direction finding and false bearings. At approximately 8 a.m. ship time, Earhart sent another transmission. We received your signals, but unable to get a minimum. Please take a bearing on us and answer with voice. Shortly after, the Itasca replied,
Signal received okay. It is impossible to take a bearing on 3105 on your voice. Send us a longer transmission, please. Over.
However, Earhart was unable to respond on a frequency compatible with the ship's direction-finding equipment. Although the Coast Guard had warned the Itasca that Earhart's aircraft could only take bearings on signals between 200 and 1,500 kHz, the ship never corrected her frequency request. The Itasca's radio men continued trying to reach her, but received no response. At 8:43 local ship time, Earhart's voice was heard by the crew of the Itasca. It would be the final confirmed transmission ever received from her. Earhart stated,
East Howe able Queen to Itasca. We are on the position line 157-337.
We are running north and south.
We hear you. We hear you. Are you receiving us?
She would try again on 6,210 kilohertz. The transmission cut off abruptly. Those listening held their breath. Then the radio fell silent. After several hours without any contact, it was presumed Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan likely ditched into the Pacific Ocean after running out of fuel. As a result, the Itasca departed Howland Island to search the surrounding waters. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard quickly joined the effort, launching the largest search and rescue mission in U.S. history up to that point. The operation cost $4 million, nearly $100 million today, and involved 9 Navy ships and many support vessels. However, after 16 days of searching, no trace of Earhart, Noonan, or their Lockheed Electra was ever found. Communication breakdown due to faulty equipment likely prevented Earhart and Noonan from locating Howland Island. A crucial antenna, mounted beneath the Electra and essential for receiving low-frequency signals, was not functioning properly. Some believe it may have been damaged or lost during takeoff from Lae, New Guinea, while others suspect it was never fully reconnected after earlier repairs. Yet, this explanation does not account for the enduring mystery of their disappearance. Given the Electra's cruising speed of roughly 185 miles per hour, 300 kilometers per hour, one might expect to find wreckage near the location of their final transmission. The absence of any confirmed debris continues to baffle investigators and enthusiasts alike, fueling speculation and a variety of theories even decades later. After the initial search near the last transmission, the search shifted to nearby islands like Nikumaroro. This new search area was based on the idea that Amelia and Noonan possibly landed and were living as castaways. Despite multiple expeditions over the decades searching for wreckage and artifacts on and around Nikumaroro, no signs of Amelia and Noonan were ever found. More recent search efforts have also been launched to try to locate traces of the plane. In August 2019, renowned oceanographer Robert Ballard, who was featured in one of our previous videos in his quest to find the Titanic, also led an expedition to Nikumaroro Island. His team used the ROV Hercules, a deep-sea robotic submarine capable of exploring the ocean floor at great depths, equipped with high-resolution cameras, sonar, and manipulator arms for investigating potential wreckage sites around Nikumaroro Island. After an extensive search, no wreckage was ever found. A few years later, in 2023, Tony Romeo and his team at Deep Sea Vision embarked on a deep-sea expedition to locate Amelia Earhart's missing Lockheed Electra. Utilizing an unmanned underwater drone, they surveyed over 5,200 square miles of the Pacific Ocean floor near Howland Island, where Earhart was last known to be. In January 2024, they released a sonar image resembling the aircraft, sparking widespread excitement. However, after further investigation, the team determined that the object was not Earhart's plane, but a natural rock formation. Romeo expressed disappointment.
Well, you'd be hard-pressed to convince me that it's anything but an aircraft, for one, and two, that it's not Amelia's aircraft.
Deep Sea Vision remains committed to their mission and continues to search for definitive evidence of Earhart's disappearance. As we discussed in our video on the disappearance of Flight MH370, where there's a lack of debris or wreckage, people often turn to conspiracy theories to fill the gaps, and the disappearance of Amelia Earhart has sparked similar speculation. Some of the alternative theories surrounding Earhart's disappearance suggest that she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, crash-landed or were forced down in the Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands, where they were allegedly taken prisoner.
Starting with the man standing on the left, compelling evidence it's Fred Noonan.
The hairline is the most distinctive characteristic. It's a very sharp, receding hairline.
Then the woman sitting on the dock.
The hair is too long for a man and too short for a woman who's a native.
It looks like she's even wearing pants.
That itself could be evidence. Few women in the world wore pants in 1937, certainly not many Pacific Islanders. Without a face to work from, Gibson conducted body measurements comparing older photos of Earhart.
Certain versions claim they died in captivity on Saipan, while others propose that Earhart survived and lived out her life under an assumed identity. Others go a step further, drawing direct parallels to the mysterious disappearance of Flight MH370, suggesting that government involvement may have played a role in Earhart's vanishing. Although numerous alleged sightings of Earhart have been reported, all have been widely discredited. To this day, the fate of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan remains one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. Perhaps one day, a renewed search will uncover the wreckage and finally bring closure to a story that has captivated the world for nearly a century. For a deeper look at another unresolved aviation mystery, watch our video on Flight MH370, often called modern aviation's greatest mystery. As always, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.